The sun beat down mercilessly on the ranch yard, where dust swirled under the boots of men who worked from dawn until dusk. Among them was a cowboy who never raised his voice, never boasted of his skill, and never sought the attention that others craved. He kept to himself, quiet and steady, doing the hardest jobs without complaint. But in a land where pride was louder than respect, silence was mistaken for weakness. The foreman, hardened by years of barking orders, made him the target of scorn. With a sneer that cut as sharp as any whip, he spat the words, "You're nobody." The insult echoed across the yard, drawing laughter from a few and silence from others. The cowboy did not answer. His hat shadowed his eyes, his hands continued their work, and his stillness only fed the foreman's arrogance. To the men watching, it seemed like another day on the ranch, another display of power by the foreman who thought himself untouchable. Yet beneath the dust and the weight of ridicule, there was a truth none of them could see, a truth that would turn their world upside down. For the quiet cowboy carried more than calloused hands and a calm spirit. He carried knowledge of every fence post, every grazing field, every stretch of land that stretched beyond the horizon. He knew the soil, the cattle, the seasons, because it was not just work to him, it was legacy. The very ranch where he was mocked, the foreman commanded, and the men labored was his inheritance, his birthright, his responsibility. He was no hired hand. He was the owner, cloaked not in pride, but in humility. The foreman's laughter grew sharper with each passing day, his arrogance unchecked by those too fearful to challenge him. Yet the cowboy's silence was not weakness, it was patience. He watched, he listened, and he waited, knowing that the land itself reveals the truth in time. He had no need to rush, no desire to prove himself with words. For in the Old West, a man's worth was not measured in noise, but in the moment when silence finally speaks. And when that moment came, when the foreman discovered who truly held the ranch in his hands, the laughter would die in his throat, and the dust that once clouded the air would settle into a silence heavier than stone. The men who once joined in the mockery would remember that day not as a story of power, but as a lesson carved into their pride, that sometimes the man you call nobody is the one who holds everything. The foreman strutted through the ranch yard as though the dust itself bent to his boots. He barked orders, his voice sharp and commanding, taking pleasure in reminding the men of their place. The others obeyed, some out of fear, others out of habit, but all knew the cost of defiance. To him, the cowboy who worked quietly, never raising his eyes, seemed the easiest target. "You're nobody," he said again one morning, his words dripping with disdain. The laughter of a few men echoed, and the sting of mockery hung in the air like smoke. Yet the quiet cowboy only adjusted his gloves and kept working. That silence unsettled the foreman more than any argument would have. He thrived on resistance, fed on it, but when none came, he mistook it for weakness. What he could not understand was that the cowboy's silence was not born of fear, but of control. Years on the frontier had taught him that words could wound, but they could also reveal. And he had no desire to reveal anything. Not yet. The land itself had taught him patience, and patience is a weapon far sharper than pride. The other ranch hands began to notice. They saw how the cowboy moved with purpose, how he knew which cattle were restless before they broke the fence, how he repaired tack before it snapped, how his steady gaze caught storms before they reached the horizon. He never asked for praise, never sought recognition, but his presence steadied them more than the foreman's orders ever could. Quietly, they began to trust him, though none dared say it aloud. The foreman's arrogance, however, grew. He bragged in town that the ranch would fall apart without his command, that the owner was a fool for leaving things in his hands. He drank whiskey with the merchants, speaking loudly of his power, never realizing that pride built its own gallows. And still, the cowboy remained in the shadows, his silence a mirror reflecting the foreman's ignorance. But silence is never empty. It waits, gathering weight until the moment it falls. And though the foreman believed he ruled the ranch, the truth lay hidden in the cowboy's calloused hands and watchful eyes. The day would come when that truth could no longer be ignored, and when it did, every word of mockery would turn into ash. It was a drought that revealed the first crack in the foreman's pride. The fields dried under the relentless sun, cattle grew restless, and water became scarce. The foreman barked louder, driving the men harder, but nothing improved. The ranch seemed to stagger beneath the weight of his arrogance. Meanwhile, the quiet cowboy moved steadily, guiding the herd to shaded pastures, finding hidden springs that others overlooked, rationing supplies with care. Though he never challenged the foreman openly, the men saw who truly kept the ranch alive. One evening, tempers flared. A young ranch hand snapped under the foreman's cruelty, daring to argue back. The foreman raised his hand, ready to strike, but before it could fall, the cowboy stepped forward. His voice, calm but firm, cut through the heat. Enough. It was the first word anyone had heard him speak in weeks, and it carried more weight than all the foreman's shouting combined. The hand lowered slowly, and the silence that followed was heavier than steel. The men whispered about it long into the night. It was not just the word, but the way it was spoken, calm, steady, unshaken. They realized then that authority was not in noise, but in presence. The foreman could not match it, though he tried, shouting louder the next day to reassert himself. Yet his voice rang hollow, while the cowboy's single word lingered in their minds like a brand. The foreman's unease grew. He began to sense that he was losing control, though he could not understand why. He lashed out harder, ridiculing the cowboy more, trying to break the silence that unnerved him. "You're nobody," he sneered again, his voice trembling with anger. But this time, the other ranch hands no longer laughed. Their eyes shifted, not to the foreman, but to the cowboy, waiting for him to respond. The cowboy did not answer. He simply adjusted his hat and kept working, his silence cutting deeper than any insult. The foreman could not see it, but the balance of power had already begun to shift. Respect was slipping from his grasp and finding its way into the hands of the man he mocked. And soon, the truth that had been hidden would rise, turning silence into revelation and arrogance into downfall. The drought deepened, and with it came desperation. The cattle grew lean, the grass brittle underfoot, and tempers frayed with every sunrise. The foreman strutted louder than ever, blaming the men for what no man could control, trying to disguise his failures with fury. But while his words cracked like whips, they no longer commanded the same obedience. The ranch hands had begun to look elsewhere for direction, though they dared not speak it aloud. Their eyes drifted to the quiet cowboy, whose steady presence gave them more hope than the foreman's endless noise. One day, as the herd pressed against the last patch of grass, disaster struck. A calf, weak from hunger, collapsed by the fence line. The foreman cursed and ordered the men to leave it, insisting that one loss meant nothing. But before his command could settle, the cowboy knelt beside the animal, lifting its head gently and guiding it to water. The men watched in silence as the calf regained its strength, stumbling back to its feet. It was a small act, but in it they saw something the foreman could never give: compassion born of responsibility, not arrogance. That evening, whispers spread around the bunkhouse. The men began to speak of the cowboy, not as one of them, but as something greater. They noticed how he knew the land's secrets, where the soil still held moisture, where the shadows stretched longest, where the herd could endure. They realized that while the foreman claimed command, it was the cowboy's quiet decisions that kept them alive. The truth began to stir in their hearts, though none yet understood its full weight. The foreman, blind to the shifting tide, continued his ridicule. "He's a ghost," he laughed in town, "a shadow that works but never speaks. Men like him will never matter." He did not see the merchants exchanging glances, nor the subtle nods of ranchers who had begun to respect the quiet man he mocked. The West had always honored strength, but it also honored wisdom, and wisdom, they knew, was never loud. The cowboy remained silent, his patience unshaken. He had no need to defend himself, for the land itself was speaking on his behalf. Each day that the herd endured, each moment the ranch survived the drought, his worth became clearer. And while the foreman's pride blinded him, the men knew the truth was drawing near, the day when silence would no longer hide what had always been his. The breaking point came with a storm. After weeks of heat and dust, thunder rolled across the plains, splitting the sky with jagged light. The foreman, eager to prove his authority, ordered the herd driven through the storm to the upper pastures. The men hesitated, knowing the risk: flooded gullies, lightning strikes, panicked cattle. But fear of his wrath held them still. Just as they began to move, the cowboy stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Not that way." The foreman sneered, furious at the defiance. "And what would you know, nobody?" He spat, his words sharp as the storm itself. But the cowboy's eyes did not waver. "The riverbed will flood," he said simply. "You'll lose half the herd before morning." The men froze, torn between obedience and reason. The foreman barked again, louder, but doubt gnawed at his command. For the first time, his voice did not carry the same certainty. When the storm broke, it was the cowboy's path that saved them. While the foreman raged, the men followed the quiet rider, leading the herd to higher ground where the earth held firm. Lightning split the sky, rain fell in sheets, and the river below raged with deadly force. Had they followed the foreman's orders, dozens of cattle and men would have been lost. Instead, the herd stood safe in the storm's shadow, trembling but alive. The men knew then what they had only whispered before: the cowboy was no ordinary hand. His silence was not weakness, but wisdom. His calm was not emptiness, but strength. They saw how he read the land like a book, how his instincts were carved from years of hardship, and how his choices carried the weight of responsibility the foreman could never grasp. Respect burned in their eyes, not shouted but carried in the quiet glances they exchanged. The foreman, drenched and defeated, felt the weight of his authority slipping away. His shouts could not drown out the truth the storm had revealed. The men no longer looked to him. They looked to the cowboy, the very man he had called nobody. And though the truth of ownership remained hidden, it was clear that power had already shifted. The land itself had chosen its voice, and it was not the foreman's. The storm passed, leaving the land soaked and trembling under the weight of water. The herd survived, but the men's loyalty had shifted forever. Around the campfires, they spoke not of the foreman's orders, but of the cowboy's calm guidance. They recounted how he had saved the herd, how his voice, though soft, had cut through the storm louder than thunder. Respect grew in whispers, carried not with noise but with conviction. The foreman saw it in their eyes, saw how their shoulders leaned toward the cowboy, how their trust no longer belonged to him. The foreman's pride festered like an old wound. He could not stand the thought of being overshadowed by a man he had mocked for so long. His arrogance twisted into envy, and envy into rage. He began to plot ways to humiliate the cowboy, to break the respect that was growing around him. In town, he spread lies, saying the cowboy had only been lucky, that anyone could have made the same call during the storm. But deep inside, he knew the truth. Luck had nothing to do with it. Wisdom had. Meanwhile, the cowboy continued as he always had, quiet, steady, tireless. He fixed fences before they collapsed, guided cattle to grazing before hunger set in, and mended saddles with a care that showed his respect for both man and beast. To the men, it became clear that he carried the ranch not on his back but in his soul. They began to question why such a man had not already been placed in charge, why his silence was valued less than the foreman's noise. Slowly, their loyalty shifted from obedience to conviction. The foreman noticed and struck harder. One morning, in front of the entire crew, he pointed a finger at the cowboy and barked, "You're still nobody. You think you saved the herd. You're nothing but a hand, and you always will be." The men froze, their jaws clenched, their hands twitching at their sides. But the cowboy did not respond. He simply looked at the foreman with a steady gaze that spoke more than words ever could. That silence, stronger than thunder, burned the foreman more deeply than any insult. In that moment, the men knew the truth. A leader does not need to scream to be heard. A leader does not need to boast to be respected. Leadership is proven in storms, in silence, and in sacrifice. And though the foreman still held the title, his power had already died. The cowboy's quiet strength had claimed it, and soon the revelation would come that would shatter every illusion the foreman clung to. The day of revelation arrived in the most ordinary way. A letter, sealed and stamped with authority, came to the ranch. The foreman snatched it from the messenger, assuming it was addressed to him, for he had long believed himself the master of all things here. But as his eyes scanned the page, The color drained from his face. The letter bore the name of the true owner, the one whose silence had cloaked the greatest truth of all, the cowboy himself. The men gathered, curious about the commotion. The foreman, his voice trembling with fury, shouted, "This must be a mistake. It says the ranch belongs to him." All eyes turned to the cowboy, who remained still, his expression calm, his hands folded in quiet certainty. The truth had been spoken aloud at last, and the silence that followed was heavier than stone. Every insult, every sneer, every word of mockery now hung in the air like smoke choking the foreman. The ranch hands looked at one another, astonishment written across their faces. Suddenly, everything made sense. The cowboy's knowledge of the land, his calm in the storm, his patience with every decision. He had not been a nobody. He had been the very heart of the ranch, carrying its weight while others squandered their pride. Respect turned into reverence, not shouted but felt, as they realized they had been working beside the true master all along. The foreman's rage boiled over. "You deceived us," he cried, his pride too wounded to admit the truth. But the cowboy shook his head. "I never deceived anyone," he said softly. "I just didn't need to tell you who I was. The land speaks for itself, and it tells me everything I need to know." His words struck deeper than any blow, for they revealed the emptiness of the foreman's noise compared to the weight of his silence. And with that, the balance of power shifted entirely. The men no longer feared the foreman, no longer bowed to his arrogance. They stood behind the cowboy, not because of his title, but because of his character. The foreman's sneers had turned to dust, and the quiet man he had mocked as nobody was revealed as the one who owned everything. The ranch, the respect, and the loyalty of the men all belonged to him now, as they always had. The revelation spread across the ranch like wildfire. By sunset, every hand, from the youngest boy to the oldest wrangler, knew the truth. The man they had called nobody was in fact the owner of every acre of land beneath their boots. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others muttered in shame at the memory of their laughter. But most felt a quiet relief, for deep down, they had already trusted the cowboy more than the foreman. Now their instincts had been proven right, and respect became loyalty. The foreman, however, refused to bow to the truth. His pride, once his crown, had become his noose. He shouted louder, trying to cling to the authority that had slipped through his fingers. "I kept this place alive," he roared. "Without me, you'd all be nothing." But the men no longer listened. Their eyes no longer followed him. Instead, they looked to the cowboy, who stood silent, his presence more commanding than the foreman's fury could ever be. That silence was unbearable to the foreman. Every moment the cowboy stood calm and unmoved felt like a mirror reflecting his own emptiness. He could not understand how a man with so few words could hold such power. Rage twisted him, but rage could not change what the land and the law had already declared. The ranch no longer belonged to him. If it ever had, it had always been the cowboy's, and now everyone knew it. The ranch hands began to step closer to the cowboy, not with noise or shouts, but with small gestures of respect. One offered him his hat, another pledged to ride wherever he led. These men had long labored under the foreman's barked orders, but now they found themselves drawn to a different kind of leader, one who commanded not with volume, but with presence. They realized that true authority comes not from fear, but from trust freely given. And still, the cowboy spoke little. He let the silence do the work, for silence had carried him through storms, through drought, and now through revelation. He did not need to humiliate the foreman. The man's own pride had already done that. All he needed to do was stand, steady and unshaken, and let the truth breathe. In the West, where words were cheap and pride often fatal, his quiet strength was worth more than gold. The foreman's downfall came not with a gunfight, nor with shouts, but with the weight of silence pressing down upon him. Each man who turned his gaze away stripped another piece of his authority. Each nod of respect toward the cowboy was another nail in the coffin of his pride. He had mocked the quiet man as a nobody, but now he stood exposed as the true pretender, a hollow leader whose voice rang empty in the vastness of the plains. For days, he lingered, trying to assert control, but his words no longer carried weight. The men did their work under the cowboy's unspoken guidance, watching his small gestures, following his steady decisions. They no longer needed to be told who led them. It was obvious in the way he knew the land, the cattle, and the people. The foreman became a shadow, loud but ignored, like wind rattling a loose shutter on an empty house. One evening, unable to bear it any longer, he confronted the cowboy. "You should have told me," he hissed. "You made me look like a fool." The cowboy lifted his gaze, calm and steady. "You did that yourself," he replied softly. "Respect isn't taken, it's earned. And you spent your years wasting it." The words were few, but they struck with the force of a hammer, shattering the last of the foreman's pride. The ranch hands witnessed it all. They saw a man broken not by violence, but by truth, and a leader revealed not by boast, but by silence. It was a lesson deeper than any sermon, a reminder that arrogance crumbles when faced with humility. They understood that they had been blind, and that the cowboy's quiet strength had been guiding them all along, even when they failed to see it. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fire and ash, the foreman walked away, his figure shrinking against the endless land. He left with nothing, not respect, not loyalty, not even his pride. Meanwhile, the cowboy remained, rooted like the ranch itself, silent but unshaken. The man once mocked as nobody stood revealed as everything, and in that truth, the men found both shame and salvation. In the days that followed, the ranch settled into a new rhythm. Without the foreman's constant barking, the air felt lighter, as if the land itself had breathed a sigh of relief. The men found themselves working harder, not out of fear, but out of respect. They watched the cowboy closely, learning from his quiet ways, how he read the skies for storms, how he walked the fields with patience, how he spoke few words yet gave clear direction. His leadership was not announced, it was lived, and that made it stronger than any command ever shouted. The boy who once laughed the loudest at him became his shadow, trailing him from corral to pasture. He asked endless questions, but the cowboy answered sparingly, teaching more through action than speech. One day the boy asked, "Why didn't you tell them you owned the ranch?" The cowboy paused, resting his hand on the fence rail. "Because land doesn't make a man," he said softly. "How you care for it, and for the people on it, that's what makes you somebody." The boy never forgot those words, for they carried a weight no boast could match. In town, whispers of the revelation spread. Merchants and ranchers spoke of the quiet cowboy who had endured scorn only to be revealed as the true master. Some told the story with awe, others with shame, but all agreed that it was a lesson none could ignore. In a land where pride often led men to ruin, here was proof that humility could outlast arrogance, that silence could carry a man further than noise. His story became more than gossip, it became legend. The ranch hands, once divided by fear, grew united under his watch. They respected his patience, his fairness, and the way he never asked for more than he gave himself. Where the foreman had ruled with force, the cowboy led with example. They began to realize that they were not just working a ranch. They were part of something larger, something rooted in honor. And with that realization, loyalty became stronger than any contract. But the cowboy remained unchanged. He still rose before dawn, still worked the land with his own hands, still carried himself with the same quiet dignity. Ownership had not altered him, because ownership had never defined him. What defined him was the same thing that had always set him apart: his silence, his patience, and his unshakable strength. The world had only just discovered who he was, but he had always known. As the weeks turned into months, the ranch thrived under his care. The cattle grew strong again, the fields began to recover, and the men found pride in their work. Where once they had dreaded the foreman's voice, now they looked forward to the cowboy's steady presence. His silence gave them confidence, for they knew that when he did speak, it was with purpose, and in the rhythm of the land, they felt something deeper than duty. They felt belonging. The boy who had once mocked him grew into his eager apprentice, learning every lesson the cowboy offered. He discovered that strength was not in shouting, but in endurance, that leadership was not in command, but in example. And though he was young, he carried himself differently, shaped by the quiet influence of the man he had once ridiculed. Through the boy, the cowboy's legacy began to take root, reaching beyond his own years. Travelers passing through often asked about the ranch, curious about the story they had heard in whispers. The townsfolk would nod toward the quiet man working in the fields and say, "That's him, the one they called Nobody." Their words carried both warning and wisdom, a reminder not to mistake silence for weakness, nor humility for emptiness. For in the Old West, reputations were often louder than truth, but here was a man whose truth had silenced all noise. The foreman's name faded, remembered only in stories told as caution. His downfall was not celebrated with laughter, but marked with reflection. Men realized that arrogance could make a man loud, but could not make him strong. True strength, they learned, lies in the man who endures without the need for applause. The cowboy had not defeated the foreman with fists or bullets, but with the steady weight of character, and that victory would endure longer than any duel. And so the legend settled into the land itself. The cowboy, once mocked as Nobody, became the very measure of what it meant to be a man in the Old West. His silence was no longer mistaken for weakness, but remembered as the deepest form of strength. And for generations, men would tell the story of the quiet cowboy who owned the ranch, reminding each other that sometimes the one overlooked holds everything. The story of the quiet cowboy is not just about a ranch, nor about a foreman's downfall. It is about the danger of judging a man by the noise he makes. In the dust and silence of the West, many mistook humility for weakness, but time revealed that the one they mocked as Nobody carried everything in his hands: wisdom, strength, and the very land they stood on. His silence was not emptiness, but fullness waiting for its moment to speak. The foreman's fate became a mirror for us all. His arrogance shouted so loudly that he could not hear the truth. He lived believing power was measured in orders and fear, until the day came when his voice meant nothing. The cowboy, in contrast, proved that true authority does not need to raise its tone. It lives in actions, in patience, in the ability to endure storms without losing dignity. And when silence finally speaks, it drowns out every false word. This lesson reaches beyond the ranch. How many times in life do we dismiss the quiet ones, overlooking the strength they carry in silence? How often do we allow arrogance to blind us to true wisdom? The cowboy's story reminds us that value is not always worn on the surface, and greatness is often hidden in humility. The world may call someone Nobody, but time has a way of revealing who truly holds everything. As the sun set on that chapter of the ranch, the cowboy stood not as a man transformed, but as the same steady soul he had always been. His legacy was not the land alone, but the truth he embodied, that silence can be stronger than pride, and humility can outlast arrogance. That is the lesson the Old West carved into the hearts of those who witnessed it, and it is a lesson we are still called to remember today. And if this story stirred something in you, if it made you reflect on the strength found in silence and the wisdom hidden in humility, then stay with us on this journey. Subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and let your voice join this circle of reflection. Together, we keep alive the stories that remind us of what truly matters, ensuring they echo far beyond the dust of the West.